Hello, everyone. This is Dorie Clark, and we are here with our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. This week's guest is Dr. Stefanie Johnson. Stefanie is the author of the book Inclusify, and she's a professor at the University of Colorado. And we're going to be talking today about how to lead an inclusive organization, which is certainly a goal for many of us these days, and we're going to learn how to do it better. Stefanie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dory. I'm so excited to be here at the start of 2022 with you.
Absolutely. This is our first Newsweek conversation for 2022. So we're delighted to kick it off with you as well. And if you are tuning in and joining us live, please feel free to type into the chat box and let us know who you are, where you're calling in from, and any questions that you have for Dr. Stefanie Johnson about creating a more inclusive organization. How can we do that the right way? So, Stefanie, the place that I wanted to start with you, it seems like, in general, almost every leader has good intentions. People want to create inclusive organizations. This is the stated goal for many people. And yet, often it doesn't happen. Often organizations and leaders, in fact, themselves fall short. What are the biggest problems? What are the reasons why our aspirations often do not match reality?
That is the question, right? And that is one of my big insights from writing Inclusify was people really want to do this. And this, I wrote the book and did the research before 2020. So before we've seen so much added inequality surrounding COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement with the murder of George Floyd and so many others, that I think this has only increased the number of people who say they really want to be able to do this and do this well. Problem, I think what holds us back is we don't always know what it means to include others. So we look at, just like everything else, right? We look at everything through our own lens and we might think, well, I naturally feel like I belong everywhere I go. And I've seen this when I do workshops with leaders. I ask them, tell me about a time when you felt like you didn't belong. And for many of them, they're like, that's a question I cannot answer. And not, universally, like lots of people have certainly had experiences. And I don't know if folks listening, want to chime in on this, but it's hard to understand what might make other people not feel like they belong if you generally feel like you belong. And so that's one part, is that some of this work just really starts with perspective taking and listening and trying to get a deeper understanding of other people you work with. And that's not a natural skill for everyone.
I think you raise a great point. And in fact, something that I talk about a lot, one of the topics that I write and speak about is networking. And it's interesting because I identify as an introvert. And of course, there are a million different facets of diversity, one of which is introverts versus extroverts. That gets talked about less. But a drum that I like to beat is that the default in our system is that things are optimized for extroverts. And if an extrovert, oftentimes, if an extrovert is planning something and they are not keenly tuned in, they will create, some kind of a networking event that works for them because, an extrovert can kind of grow in any soil, but introverts require something a little bit different, which is why I've become so deliberate about organizing my own events so that I can optimize them for myself. So I think you raise a really interesting point.
Well, and I always use that example because, we know there's a lot, I talk a lot for like organizations in tech and finance, and a lot of those folks, like anyone can relate to that example of introversion, extroversion. And we know that there's immense power in hearing from our introverts. And so if you use that as an example and just think like, well, what else are you missing? Because there are, very extroverted, let's just say women or women of color or people of color who also don't get a voice. And so I use examples of like, if you happen to be that person who has a microphone or a megaphone, because you're extroverted or because you may be in the majority group member, you might have some power, people listen to you, that sometimes it's as simple as lending that microphone or megaphone to other people.
I love that. That's great. And we want to greet some of the great friends who are tuning in to join us. We have Terry here from Maryland. We have Diane from Cleveland. Marion's here from Jasper, Georgia. Anna's here from New Hampshire. We've got Chie from Columbus. Luis is from Brazil. Akiko is tuning in from San Jose. This is fantastic. We've got a LinkedIn user from Santa Barbara. Gail is here from North Carolina. Dennis is here. We have Kat from Missouri and many other friends tuning in. Thank you for joining us. So we're here with Dr. Stefanie Johnson. Stefanie is the author of the new book, Inclusify. Stefanie, something that I'm curious about, in your book, you talk about different roles that people in the workplace can take on. You talk about categories of leaders. So you have white knights, you have culture crusaders, you have shepherds. It sounds like there are different roles that people can take on. Can you explain this a little bit? What are these categories and why is this important? Why do we need all these different types of roles?
Yeah, so these are the common leader archetypes that I found in my research of leaders who are really committed to diversity and inclusion. They say that they want to do this, and yet they're just maybe slightly missing the mark. So they need to pivot. And I found it really useful in categorizing, the common missteps that leaders make. So you mentioned a white knight. I feel like I'm seeing more white knights in my research. These are leaders who are overemphasizing maybe uniqueness. Like they really talk about diversity a lot. It seems like, how could that ever be bad, right? Like this is good, this is the goal. But maybe the risk of that is that they might be leaving out majority group members who feel like they're not included in this conversation. And what we know from the majority of research is diversity and inclusion initiatives are most effective when everyone's on board. Like this is something we need everyone to participate in. Everyone benefits from it. And so if your actions or your words are excluding certain people, then you're going to have less of a positive benefit. The flip side is like a culture crusader who's really emphasizing belonging without paying attention to the fact that belonging is different for different people. And you need to emphasize the fact that different voices and perspectives and identities need to be valued equally. And not just let's throw everyone together in matching t-shirts and say, oh, you all belong because you're here, right? Because not everyone's going to naturally experience that belonging.
Really good point. Thank you for that. And Anna is tuning in with a question for us, Stefanie. She says she's curious, what is your advice for leaders that have the potential to inclusify their organization, but maybe they're just finding themselves languishing because of the pandemic? We've all been hit hard by the pandemic. It's 2 years now, and it's like, oh, again? And we're going through it. It feels like we never really get out of it. You want to do something. You want to improve your organization, your organizational culture, but it just seems hard sometimes to get out of our own way and deal with so much of the angst and the challenges that we've been feeling. If someone is just feeling burned out, worn down, they want to do something, but they're not even sure what advice would you give them?
I totally relate. Before jumping on this conversation, I got the, email from my kids' school, delayed. We're not going back for another week. It's like it feels like every semester, this is something. And I'm from Colorado, and we've just gone through additional strain of these massive wildfires. And it just seems like people are so burnt out and so spent, right? And so I guess two things that really come to mind for me is one, that analogy of like, you've got to put on your own oxygen mask first. It's like, take care of yourself first, because you're not going to be inclusifying anything if you can't show up, right? Because you're so burned out. So take care of yourself first, whatever that means for you. And then the second thing is, I guess I don't feel like this has to be an added strain or chore. There's so much joy in doing this work. Like, yes, it's work. Yes, it can be difficult, but maybe start with what is energizing for you. Like for me, as a kind of data nerd and scientist, like I would start with the data. Look at the data from your organization or your team. Look at your numbers, who's doing well, who can use work, where are you successful in the organization, what can you learn from the data? Then set some goals of what it is that you'd want to change. Goals are motivating. You're moving towards something. and then come up with some strategies and plans to start moving toward those goals. And that can be actually super energizing, right? Because then you can track your data and look at how you're making progress. And hopefully you see some change, and that just fills you up more. I don't know. What do you think? Does that resonate with you?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Thank you, Stefanie. Again, we've been talking with Stefanie Johnson. She's the author of the book Inclusify. We're talking about how to lead an inclusive organization. If you want to learn more about Stefanie and her work, go to drstefjohnson.com. And if you want to make sure that you never miss one of our weekly Newsweek Better series, you can actually just go to dorieclark.com/LI. That stands for LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn, subscribe to my LinkedIn newsletter, and you will get regular updates about our fantastic guests, including Stefanie Johnson. If you're liking this conversation, please hit the like button, please hit the share button so that your friends and colleagues can benefit from it as well. And we had, Stefanie, a question come in that I thought was a great one from Diane. And she was curious. She says, she sees a lot of folks from countries outside the U.S., and she's curious if you can talk a little bit about how diversity might be similar or different in a cross-cultural environment. We sort of have a picture in our American context about what diversity means, but obviously around the world, it means all kinds of different dynamics. Can you speak a little bit more to how this might apply internationally?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Diane. I actually did a course on this topic on LinkedIn Learning. Diversity and Inclusion in the Global Enterprise is the course. And it focuses just on this fact that it's so different. And you might be in a multinational organization that's trying to come up with one big diversity strategy for all of the countries that you operate in, but that really you need to come up with both a global strategy and then local strategies to make sure that the goals and initiatives that you're planning make sense for that cultural context, right? So what are the differences? I'll say one thing that's really blown me away is how important this topic is across the globe. And so I've been doing presentations in Europe, in Asia, all talking about the same topic. In South America, there are differences though, a little bit in the focus. And so I would say in the US, I think the focus is much stronger on racial equity than it is, say, in Europe, where I think they're still more focused on gender equity. But all of these, I think rising one boat rises all the boats. So creating equity hopefully creates equity for everyone, right? If your initiative works, it works for everyone. But I think that's the biggest difference that I've seen. It's not to say that people don't care about racial equity in Europe, but I'm seeing more of a focus there on the gender side.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thank you, Stefanie. We just want to say hi to some of the great folks who are tuning in to join us live. If you're just joining, please feel free to type into the chat box and let us know who you are and where you are dialing in from. Cheryl's here from Minneapolis. We've got Adnan from Turkey who's joining us. Shelby's here from North Carolina. Kathleen is in the house from Iowa. We've got one of your fellow Coloradans who's joining us as a LinkedIn user. Sandy's here from Dallas. Javad is from Iran. This is great. Hiba's joining us from Dubai. Hakeem from India. Gabriel from Mexico. Bidya from Amsterdam, and many more. We're so happy to have all of our friends, both domestic and international. So it's great to have all of you here. Please type your questions for Dr. Stefanie Johnson into the chat box. Now, Stefanie, something that I'm curious about is how the shift to remote and hybrid work is impacting diversity and inclusion efforts. We have heard a lot about how it may be a little bit harder for employees perhaps who are in caregiving roles, that they might not be able to sort of put in as much social effort, quote unquote, in terms of relationship building. We have challenges because if you're not in the office full-time, face-to-face, maybe diversity becomes a little easier to forget or to shunt off to the side. What are you seeing out there? Or maybe in some ways it's better, who knows, because you're less exposed to microaggressions. What is your take, and how has remote and hybrid work impacted inclusion and efforts to inclusify?
Yeah, I mean, I would say early on in the pandemic, there was a lack of effort toward D&I. Like people weren't focusing on it. Their HR and even the D&I team was being pulled in to deal with the massive HR issues, right? And that's completely flipped, where I think this is top of mind for human resources, it's top of mind, obviously for diversity and inclusion experts. And I actually feel really optimistic that a lot of these changes can create more equity if we're really intentional about it. And so if you think about how the workplace was originally built and designed and who it was designed for, it wasn't designed for, dual earner couples with children, or it really wasn't designed for women. It wasn't designed with people of color in mind, the LGBTQ plus community, or even people with disabilities, right? That just wasn't the central thought as the workplace evolved. And it's really hard to change that. And I would say 2 years ago, if you said, what's the biggest thing holding back diversity and inclusion? I'd say it's the status quo. It's like the default. This is how we've always done it. Well, guess what? Nothing is how we've always done it. And that means we have an incredible opportunity to redesign the workplace. And we can design it in a way that's not going to be conducive to diversity and inclusion and belonging and equity, or we can choose to create a workplace that really works for everyone. And I think that's why I'm optimistic, is to have these things collide, where we're redesigning the workplace and diversity and inclusion is so top of mind. Just think of the opportunities for creating greater equity and justice in organizations. I think it's huge. I think there's a real opportunity. And I think that a lot of leaders are really working to seize that opportunity right now. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest just pitfalls that I've seen relates to exactly your question, Dorie. And that is, certain people are less likely to be able to go into the workplace. We see people of color and women of color maybe choosing not to go into the office. And so the opportunity there is to design meetings and interactions in a way that are equitable. So it's not just like all the people in the office are face-to-face. If you've been in these meetings, I have, right? That the two people who are remote are on Zoom and they're like in a tiny computer, somewhere, and then everyone else is face-to-face. And those two people are not included. Like, give me a break. It's not possible. So what has been more effective is organizations saying, if not everyone can be there, we're all going to take the meeting separately on our computers. And then if we really want the face-to-face time, we're going to use that for maybe more social time or instances where we're not leaving people out.
Yeah, that's a really great point. We're here talking with Stefanie Johnson. If you want to learn more about her work, go to drstefjohnson.com, including her new book, Inclusify. So, Stefanie, we have some great questions coming in from our viewers. We want to say hi to folks who have just joined us. Allah is here from Germany. We've got Robert from Berlin. We've got Clarice from Congo, Vasilios from Greece, and Jackie from Yorkshire, Andy from Boston. So glad to have all of you. Kristen from Rochester. But a question came in from Marion in Georgia. I thought this was really interesting. So, Stefanie, Marion wants to know, with a broad mix of generations now represented in the workforce, what advice do you have for leaders about how to create intergenerational inclusion? If you're a baby boomer, all of a sudden you're dealing with Gen Z or vice versa. What do you do about that? And how do you actually create an intergenerationally inclusive workforce?
I think a really good quick tip is to form some intergenerational reverse or reciprocal mentoring relationships. Particularly boomers and millennials really seem to jive, and both really benefit from the relationship. Same thing with, I would say, Gen Z. I know I'm not lumping Gen Z together and there's really not enough data, but I'm going to just extrapolate and say I think it would be true for Gen Z as well, because the boomers learn a lot from the younger generation in terms of diversity and inclusion, topics like that, and social media, all those, techie kind of things. And what the data show is that the millennials and Gen Zers learn a ton in terms of institutional knowledge and expertise from the boomers, and they just seem to get along. So they really jive. I think I'm a Gen X. I don't know that my generation got along as well with others, but those two generations, the data show, really, really get along well. And it can be incredibly fulfilling for both sides, because I think one of the things that we're really missing right now is human connection. And so you're building the human connection and providing great opportunities for exchanging knowledge.
I love it. Reverse mentoring all the way. That's fantastic. We want to say hi to some of the folks tuning in to join us and talking about leading an inclusive organization. David's here from Texas. We've got Ravi from Delhi. We've got Paula joining us. We've got Brian from Phoenix and Elizabeth from Detroit, Yisel from New York. We've got Kristen from Dallas. We've got Regina from Calgary and Badri from London. So many great folks. Thank you for being here. And I wanted to bring a question to the forefront, Stefanie, from Jessica. She is curious. This is a great question. What's the best way to determine how people want to belong? Is it surveys? Do you do these top-down programs? Like, how do we make sure that we're giving people what they do want, and we're not just shoving something down their throat that we're like, oh, this sounds like a great idea. What would you recommend to make sure it actually is relevant and actually is useful?
Jessica, you're a woman after my own heart. So that's my question. And I'm actually doing research on this topic right now, because if you look at things like the surveys that were developed to measure things like inclusion and belonging, if you go into the fine print on the samples for those surveys, the way they were created, you'll see that they, at least in my review of the research, the samples were not diverse. And so we're extrapolating from a relatively homogeneous sample of people and using those measures to measure how everyone feels like they belong or feel included. I don't think it is capturing everyone's experience. I don't think it's accurate, right? So I would say, I think I use the surveys. Keep using the surveys. They're useful. You can do pulse surveys, get a little bit of data, do the annual survey. I'm not saying do away with them, but I don't think that grassroots effort, that human connection and getting to know people, your specific employees one-on-one, can be overshadowed by the survey data, because not people's experiences aren't always going to be in there. And so just listening to people, and maybe there's things that wouldn't be on the survey, or you couldn't capture people's what they really, really want. And I don't think our field from a research perspective really knows what it takes to make people feel like they belong. And so I think that's a big gap for researchers to tackle, because I think you nailed it. Like you don't want to be giving people things that they don't want and then saying, oh, I did the things, you should just feel like you belong now, right? Like I checked my box, so go ahead and feel like you belong. Like these are human beings. It doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. Stefanie Johnson is the author of the new book, Inclusify. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of our weekly Newsweek series, it's noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. Go to DorieClark.com. You can sign up for my newsletter, get a free self-assessment, and you'll get reminders about these great conversations. So, Stefanie, we wanted to just say hello to some of the terrific folks who have newly tuned in to join us. Michael's here from Ghana. Heather's here from Phoenix. Zeynep is here from Turkey. We have Alejandro from Estonia. We have Maureen from the Jersey Shore and Jean-Baptiste from Rwanda. So many international folks tuning in with great questions. We're glad to have you here. And one that I thought was especially interesting, Annette is from Southern California, and she wants to know, Stefanie, what recommendations do you have for diversity and inclusion leaders in broadening their effectiveness? Now, we know that this is true. Unfortunately, a lot of folks who are working in DEI, sometimes, let's be honest, they get a little sidelined in organizations. They're a little bit pushed off to the sides. Oh, okay, nice, good. It's Black History Month. Do something. And that is not where they want to be. That's not where they should be. What is it, if you are a DEI leader, diversity, equity, and inclusion leader, that you can do to make sure that you really are stepping up and get your voice heard where it needs to be heard in the organization? What would you suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a professor, so I would say you can never go wrong with getting additional education and expertise. What I'm hearing now from D&I leaders specifically is a greater need to focus on things like strategy. Like the people who are attracted to that field tend to have really great interpersonal skills. They're fabulous on empathy. I do an exec ed class at the University of Colorado. And, I started with you got to work on empathy. And then I'm like, oh, no, you don't have to work on empathy. You have empathy for days. But instead, maybe some of the more looking at data analytics skills can be really useful, or at least being able to know enough to get other people to do some data analytics, to know whether your program is working. Understanding the broader business context is hugely important, because what we want to see is diversity and inclusion isn't a department over here, like by itself, but in fact is infused throughout all of the functions of the organization. And that means you need to understand all those functions. And so I would say that focus on the strategy and how the business is done, and then maybe some data analytics.
Really helpful. I think that makes a lot of sense. And a question came in from across the pond, Stefanie. Kimberly is here from London, and she wants to know, we've all heard that diversity is good for the bottom line. There's apparently studies, there's apparently research that says, yes, this actually makes your company better. This makes your company more profitable. Can you talk a little bit more about this? You're a professor, so I'm sure you're very steeped in all of this. Talk to us about the business case for diversity. Why is this something that is a need to have rather than just a nice to have?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Kimberly. So there's lots of data out there that you can use to make the case, right? Look at studies by organizations like McKinsey or the World Economic Forum. You can use the data. People tend to respond most positively to data within their own sector. So if I'm talking to a tech company and I show research on financial firms and how it improves, maybe investment success, they're like, that's not us. So maybe using data that are relevant to your own organizational type. But if you want to do even a deeper dive into your own organization, I would look at costs like turnover, because what we see is we're more likely to lose employees of color and female employees to our competitors. And right now with the Great Resignation, like you really don't want to be losing employees because the cost of rehiring them is immense. And then as those underrepresented employees leave, what we see is like a turnover contagion. So if there's one woman in my organization and she leaves, I'm like, oh, great. Now I'm the only woman. I'm out of there too. And so do some simple calculations like that on what it's costing to lose valued talent. And other performance metrics, if you can extrapolate from the data, look at how the changes that you've made in your organization are impacting performance in the company, innovation, creativity. We see a lot greater resilience to market pressures when companies have greater diversity. And it's important, not just diversity, but inclusion.
Yeah, thank you very much. I love that, Stefanie. That's great. And we have a few folks who are tuning in to join us. We have Hallie from Southern California. We've got Misha Gay from Miami. We have Melinda from Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and Vanda from Madrid. So happy to have all of you here. And we have time probably, Stefanie, for one more question. Again, we've been talking with Stefanie Johnson, author of the book Inclusify. And Stefanie, I love this one. Brian wants to step up. He says, how can I be a champion as a manager? He wants to get other people on board, other team members and managers on board to embrace diversity initiatives. What would be your advice for Brian and for people like him?
Yeah, Brian, thank you. I think having allies is so important. We're not going to do this without without white men participating in diversity and inclusion. So I don't want to presume your gender and racial identity, but I think that allyship is so important. And I think a unique opportunity for people in majority groups is to bring others along with them. And so how can you engage others like yourself? Because you can do a lot of good. And we can talk all day about how you can be an ally. I mentioned passing the microphone, also shining a light on other people's accomplishments, maybe the accomplishments of women and women of color and people of color who are statistically not as likely to be recognized for their good work. So those are mentoring, great opportunities for you to be an ally. But imagine the good you can do if you can bring in other allies with you to do the same thing that you're doing, but at scale. I think that's huge. And so join an ERG or a BRG, see if you can bring others with you. If you're in an executive role, be an executive sponsor, participate in mentoring, expand your network. Dorie, the expert in networking, can probably attest to the fact that our networks look a lot like us. And so what that means is when there's an opportunity available, you go to your network and you say, hey, there's this great opportunity. Well, you're missing out on a large group of talent if that network isn't diverse.
Such a good point, Stefanie. And just a note, you mentioned ERGs and BRGs for people who may not be familiar with the terminology. That's employee resource group or business resource group, which they often have inside of corporations. So thank you. I love that advice. That's terrific. Again, we've been here with Stefanie Johnson. Learn more about her work, including her book Inclusify, at drstephjohnson.com. And we've been talking about leading an inclusive organization. Steph, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome. I loved the diversity in the audience and people who tuned in today to listen and learn, and I'd love to connect. So please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or shoot me an email.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next Thursday, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. Take care.